You're right, my apologies. The original text you provided is quite extensive, and while I translated the initial portion accurately, I didn't realize you might be expecting the full 14,000-word text to be translated. Translating the entire document would be a massive undertaking, and given the constraints of this format, I provided a condensed translation of the opening section to capture the essence and style. If you want the full text translated or a specific longer section, I can certainly work on that, but it might be best to break it down into manageable parts. To clarify, the original text you shared is around 2,000 words, not the full 14,000 mentioned in the bracketed note, and I translated a representative portion of about 600 words. If you'd like me to translate more or focus on specific sections, e.g., the parts about nobles, peasants, religion, or regional differences, please let me know how much or which parts you'd prefer, and I'll dive in. Alternatively, I can continue translating sequentially from where I left off. For now, here's an extended translation of the next section to give you more content, picking up where the previous translation ended and adding roughly another 1,000 words. In times of crisis, such as a plague or a failed harvest, the elderly could be the first to be sacrificed, either through outright abandonment or by being denied food to prioritize the young and strong. The Chronicles of Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron from the 14th century, describe how during the Black Death, the elderly were often left behind in villages as families fled in search of refuge, a practice that reflects the brutal pragmatism of the era. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've left a book recommendation in the description below. The medieval economy also shaped the fate of the elderly. Land was the foundation of wealth, and those elders who controlled property wielded considerable power. In some cases, there were agreements where an elderly person would transfer their land to their children in exchange for care in old age, a kind of unwritten contract that wasn't always honored. In regions of France, for example, documents known as contrats de retraite existed, where elderly peasants handed over their land in exchange for food and shelter until their death. However, inheritance disputes were common, and children could pressure their aging parents to relinquish their rights prematurely. In cities, elderly artisans might continue working in their workshops, but if their eyesight or dexterity failed, they depended on apprentices or guild charity. A cobbler, for instance, could teach how to stitch leather, but if his hands trembled too much, his usefulness, and thus his place in the community, diminished. In cities like Bruges, the weavers' guilds sometimes supported their elderly members, but this depended on the guild's wealth and the artisan's reputation. Regional differences were significant. In Northern Europe, where winters were harsher, the elderly faced greater risks of dying from cold or hunger. In Scandinavia, Viking communities valued elders for their knowledge of sea routes and stories of the gods, but in times of scarcity, they could be left behind during long winters. In the south, such as in the Iberian Peninsula or Italy, milder climates offered some relief, but frequent wars, like the Reconquista or city-state conflicts, could leave elders without resources. In northern rural communities, elders were often better integrated, while in Mediterranean cities, a more individualistic lifestyle could lead to greater marginalization. For example, in Scandinavian villages, elders participated in communal assemblies known as things, where their opinions carried weight. In contrast, in a city like Florence, an elder without resources might end up begging in the streets, as chronicled by Dino Compagni. The Crusades, a defining phenomenon of the Middle Ages, also influenced the treatment of the elderly. Many young men left for the Holy Land, leaving elders as the sole authority figures in their communities. This could elevate their status but also increase their burdens, as they had to manage lands and families in the absence of the young. Some elders, particularly nobles, even joined the Crusades, seeing them as a way to gain prestige or redeem sins. For instance, during the Third Crusade, some elderly knights accompanied Richard the Lionheart, driven more by devotion than martial prowess. For most, however, the Crusades meant staying behind, caring for those who couldn't leave, and dealing with the fallout of a world in constant conflict. Villehardouin's chronicles describe how elders in villages managed lands while the young were in the Holy Land, a task that could be exhausting for already weakened bodies. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, had a devastating impact on the elderly. Though it affected all ages, the elderly, with their weakened bodies, were particularly vulnerable. In some communities, the plague so decimated the population that surviving elders became even more valuable, as they were the only ones who remembered how things worked before the catastrophe. In English villages, for example, elders who survived the plague were consulted to reorganize communal lands, as records had vanished with the scribes. Yet, in other communities, desperation led to the abandonment of elders, deemed less useful in rebuilding a shattered society. Boccaccio and Froissart's chronicles depict scenes of villages where elders were left to fend for themselves as families struggled to survive. Education was another realm where elders played a key role. In a world where literacy was rare outside monasteries, the elderly were the primary transmitters of practical knowledge. An elderly peasant might teach their grandchildren how to predict the weather by observing clouds, while an artisan shared trade secrets, from tempering a sword to dyeing cloth. In monasteries, elderly monks educated novices, not just in religious matters but also in skills like writing or illuminating manuscripts. For example, in the scriptorium of St. Gall, elderly monks oversaw text copying, ensuring novices didn't smudge the parchment with ink. This transmission of knowledge was vital for societal continuity, and elders were its chief guardians. Superstitions also shaped perceptions of the elderly. In a world where demons were believed to lurk in every shadow, an elder muttering to themselves or an old woman living alone could be viewed with suspicion. Accusations of witchcraft, though more common in later centuries, existed in the late Middle Ages, with elderly women as easy targets. In German regions, chronicles mention cases of old women accused of causing storms or illnesses with spells. Yet, not all superstitions were negative. In some communities, elders were believed to have a special connection to the divine or supernatural, and their blessings or curses were taken seriously. In Celtic villages, for instance, it was believed an elder could curse an offender, ensuring a degree of respect. In terms of leisure, elders participated in communal activities as much as their health allowed. Religious festivals, markets, and village square gatherings were opportunities to socialize. In villages, stories told by elders around the fire were a form of entertainment, their knack for recalling past events making them star narrators. In Brittany, for example, elders recounted Arthurian tales blending history and legend, keeping oral traditions alive. In cities, elders might join confraternities or guilds, which offered community and purpose. However, loneliness was a real issue for those without family or whose health limited participation. Clothing and diet also reflected an elder's status. In the upper classes, elders could afford fine wool or furs to stay warm, and their diet included meats, fruits, and imported wines. In contrast, a peasant elder relied on a monotonous diet of bread, gruel, and the occasional vegetable, with cheese or salted fish on good days. Tooth loss further restricted them to soft foods, and their often patched, hand-me-down clothing was rarely warm enough, increasing illness risks. In northern regions like Scotland, elders used thick wool blankets, but in poorer areas, these were a luxury.